What if everything you thought you knew about history's most sacred place was built on lies? Deep beneath the marble floors and golden altars of Vatican City, behind walls that have stood for over 1,000 years, rest secrets so explosive they could shatter the foundations of faith itself. Tonight, we're about to unlock 7 forbidden mysteries that the Catholic Church has desperately tried to keep buried. But before we descend into these shadows, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when we uncover truths that powerful institutions never wanted you to discover. Picture this. You're walking through the halls of the Vatican museums, surrounded by priceless art and ancient relics. Tourists snap photos of Michelangelo's masterpieces, completely unaware that just beyond those walls lie chambers containing artifacts that could rewrite everything we know about civilization itself. For centuries, the Vatican has positioned itself as the guardian of Christian faith and moral authority. But what happens when that same institution becomes the keeper of secrets that contradict its very teachings? What happens when holy ground becomes a tomb for truth? The stories you're about to hear aren't the product of wild conspiracy theories. They're based on archaeological evidence, historical documents, and testimonies from researchers who've spent their lives piecing together fragments of our hidden past. Some of these secrets involve the remains of history's greatest conqueror, lying in plain sight but worshipped under a false name. Others reveal how ancient Egyptian gods may have inspired the very foundation of Christianity itself. We'll explore how the world's greatest library didn't simply burn down, but may have been deliberately dismantled, its most precious scrolls spirited away to secret Vatican vaults. We'll uncover how sacred relics were stolen through conquest and disguised as preservation. And perhaps most disturbing of all, we'll reveal how the Catholic Church has used ancient Egyptian embalming techniques to create false miracles, deceiving millions of faithful believers. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are cover-ups that span millennia, involving some of the most powerful figures in human history. From Julius Caesar to Pope Gregory, from Alexander the Great to Jesus Christ himself, the threads of deception weave through every corner of our past. Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on the Vatican's most closely guarded secrets. We're about to discover that sometimes the most sacred places hold the darkest truths, and once you hear these stories, you'll never look at history the same way again. So, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey into the shadows of the most powerful religious institution on earth. Because what we uncovered tonight might just change everything you thought you knew about faith, history, and the price of keeping secrets. Our first stop takes us back over 2,000 years to the mysterious disappearance of a body that should have been impossible to lose. The body of a man who conquered the known world, but whose final resting place became history's greatest vanishing act. Are you ready to learn the truth about Alexander the Great's missing corpse and the shocking theory about where it might be hidden today? In the year 323 BCE, in a palace in Babylon, the greatest conqueror the world had ever known drew his final breath. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who had carved out an empire stretching from Greece to India, was dead at just 32 years old. But this wasn't the end of Alexander's story. In many ways, it was just the beginning of history's most bewildering mystery. What happened next should have been simple. Alexander's body was supposed to be returned to Macedonia for burial alongside his ancestors. But fate, ambition, and perhaps something far more sinister had other plans. Picture the scene. Alexander's corpse, preserved in honey and wrapped in golden cloth, became the most coveted prize in the ancient world. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, intercepted the funeral procession and brought the body to Egypt. There, in the magnificent city of Alexandria that bore Alexander's name, a tomb was constructed that would become a pilgrimage site for emperors and kings. For centuries, everyone knew exactly where Alexander lay. Julius Caesar visited the tomb and reportedly touched the conqueror's nose, accidentally breaking it. Augustus Caesar paid his respects there. Caligula even stole Alexander's breastplate from the tomb to wear as his own. But then, something impossible happened. Sometime around the 4th century CE, Alexander's body simply vanished. Not just the body, but every trace of his tomb. Imagine that. The most famous grave in the ancient world, visited by the most powerful men in history, erased so completely that we can't even find where it once stood. How does something like that just disappear? Here's where our story takes a turn that sounds like something out of a thriller novel. According to a theory that has quietly circulated among researchers for decades, Alexander's body didn't disappear at all. It was stolen, smuggled across the Mediterranean, and hidden in plain sight in one of the most unlikely places imaginable: Venice, Italy, inside the magnificent Basilica of San Marco. Now, before you dismiss this as impossible, consider the evidence. In the 9th century, Venetian merchants claimed they had retrieved the body of Saint Mark, the evangelist from Alexandria, and brought it to Venice. The same Alexandria where Alexander's tomb had mysteriously vanished. The same time period when grave robbing and relic hunting had become a lucrative business across Europe. Music becomes more investigative, like a detective theme. Think about the logistics here. You're a Venetian merchant in ancient Alexandria, a city in decline, its treasures ripe for the taking. You discover an incredibly well-preserved mummy in an ornate sarcophagus. Local Christians tell you it's Saint Mark, but what if they're wrong? What if the body you're looking at is actually Alexander the Great, misidentified over the centuries? The mummy gets smuggled to Venice, where it's installed with great ceremony in the basilica. For over 1,000 years, millions of Christians have prayed before this tomb, believing they're in the presence of a holy apostle. But what if they've actually been worshipping at the grave of a pagan conqueror? Consider the implications. Alexander was no saint. He was a ruthless military genius who conquered nations, burned cities, and declared himself a god. If his body has been masquerading as a Christian saint for over a millennium, it would represent one of the most staggering cases of mistaken identity in human history. But here's what makes this theory even more chilling. What if it was a mistake at all? What if early church officials knew exactly whose body they had acquired, but chose to rebrand a pagan emperor as a Christian martyr? Think about the power in that deception. The ability to transform history's greatest conqueror into a symbol of faith and humility. The Vatican has never officially commented on this theory, but they've also never allowed independent testing of the remains in San Marco's Basilica. The body that lies there has been examined by church officials, but never by outside archaeologists or forensic experts, who might be able to definitively identify whose remains they actually are. And there's another disturbing detail. The historical record shows that Saint Mark's body was supposedly martyred and buried in Alexandria. But so was Alexander's body entombed in Alexandria. Both disappeared from the same city, around the same time period. During an era when relic theft was rampant throughout the Christian world. Imagine walking into the Basilica of San Marco today, surrounded by tourists and pilgrims, all of them unaware that they might be standing before the earthly remains of Alexander the Great, the man who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer, whose name struck fear into the hearts of nations, potentially lying in eternal rest beneath the prayers of those who follow a religion he never knew. But this is just the beginning of how the lines between pagan and Christian, between ancient and modern, have been deliberately blurred throughout history, because what we're about to discover next will shake the very foundations of religious belief itself. What if I told you that the story of Jesus Christ, the cornerstone of Christianity, might not be as unique as believers have been taught? What if every major detail of Christ's life had been told before, thousands of years earlier, about an Egyptian god named Horus? Stay with me, because we're about to uncover parallels so precise, so impossible to ignore, that they've been deliberately hidden from public knowledge for centuries. 3,000 years before Jesus Christ walked the shores of Galilee, along the banks of the Nile River, ancient Egyptians told a story that would sound remarkably familiar to any Christian today. It was the story of Horus, the falcon-headed god whose life would mirror, detail by detail, the story that would later become the foundation of the world's largest religion. What I'm about to tell you has been one of the most suppressed theories in religious scholarship, not because it lacks evidence, but because the implications are so explosive that they threaten to unravel 2,000 years of Christian doctrine. Let me paint you a picture of Horus's birth. As recorded in Egyptian texts, thousands of years before the Gospel of Matthew was ever written, Horus was born to a virgin mother. Her name was Isis, though in some translations she appears as Merit, an ancient variant strikingly similar to Mary. His earthly father figure was Seb, whose name echoes through time like a whisper of Joseph. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. Horus was born in a cave, his birth announced by an angel, marked by the appearance of a star in the east. Are you getting chills yet? Because we're just getting started. 3 wise men, described in Egyptian texts as shepherds, came to pay homage to the newborn godchild. As Horus grew into manhood, he was baptized in a river by a man who would later be executed for his beliefs. Sound familiar? But wait, it gets worse. Horus gathered 12 disciples around him as he began his ministry. He healed the sick with nothing but his touch. He cast out demons from the possessed. He fed multitudes with small amounts of food. He walked on water. He raised the dead back to life. And then, Horus was betrayed by one of his own followers. He was crucified between 2 thieves. His body was placed in a tomb for 3 days, and on the 3rd day, he rose from the dead and ascended to heaven. Now, I want you to think about what this means. Every single major event in the life of Jesus Christ, every miracle, Every detail that Christians hold sacred was already being told in Egypt 3 millennia before Christianity existed. The parallels don't stop there. Horus was called the Way, the Truth, and the Light. He was referred to as the Good Shepherd and the Lamb of God. His followers believed he would return to judge the living and the dead. Even the concept of the Trinity, the Holy Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, existed in Egyptian religion as Osiris, Horus, and Isis. So we have to ask ourselves, is this an impossible coincidence? Did the same divine story somehow play out identically across different cultures and millennia? Or is something else going on here? Here is what makes this theory so dangerous to religious institutions. If the story of Jesus is essentially a retelling of the story of Horus, then Christianity isn't a unique revelation from God. It's a recycled mythology, repackaged for a new audience in a different time and place. Now, before you dismiss this entirely, consider how religions have always evolved and borrowed from each other throughout history. The early Christian church didn't exist in a vacuum. It emerged in a world where Egyptian mystery religions were incredibly popular, where the story of Horus was well known throughout the Roman Empire. And here's the truly unsettling part. Early Christian scholars were absolutely aware of these parallels. Church fathers like Justin Martyr actually acknowledged the similarities between Jesus and pagan gods, but claimed that Satan had planted these earlier stories to confuse people about the true Messiah, who was to come later. Think about the audacity of that explanation. Rather than admitting that Christian doctrine might have been influenced by earlier religions, they claimed that the devil had traveled back in time to create false prophecies that would undermine Christianity thousands of years before Christianity even existed. But what if the truth is far simpler and far more disturbing? What if early Christian leaders deliberately borrowed the most compelling elements from existing religions, knowing that familiar stories would be easier to spread among populations who already knew similar tales? The Vatican's archives contain thousands of documents about early Christian history, many of which have never been made public. Scholars have requested access to these materials for decades, seeking to understand how Christian doctrine developed and evolved. But these requests are consistently denied. What exactly are they protecting? What information about Christianity's origins is so dangerous that it must be kept locked away from the world? Now, some traditional scholars argue that the parallels between Horus and Jesus aren't as exact as they appear. They claim that some of the Horus stories were embellished, or that Egyptian texts don't support all of these claims, and that's a fair criticism that deserves consideration. But even if only half of these parallels are accurate, even if only a few of these similarities are real, we're still looking at a pattern that's impossible to ignore. We're still facing the uncomfortable possibility that the foundation story of Christianity might not be as original as billions of believers have been taught. And this brings us to an even more disturbing question. If the story of Jesus was borrowed from earlier sources, what else about Christian history might not be what it seems? What other foundational beliefs might be based on deliberately hidden or altered information? Because what we read about to discover next will show you just how far powerful institutions will go to control knowledge itself. We're about to enter the ruins of history's greatest library and uncover the shocking truth about what really happened to the most precious collection of human knowledge ever assembled. The Library of Alexandria didn't just burn down by accident. It was systematically destroyed by those who understood that knowledge is the most dangerous weapon of all, and some of its most explosive secrets may now be locked away in the Vatican's deepest vaults. Imagine walking through the greatest treasure vault of human knowledge that ever existed. Picture corridors lined floor to ceiling with over 400,000 scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of every major civilization, mathematics that wouldn't be rediscovered for 1,000 years, medical procedures that could save lives today, maps of continents that officially wouldn't be found for centuries, star charts revealing cosmic secrets that still elude modern astronomers. This was the Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE, the crown jewel of the ancient world's intellectual achievement. Scholars traveled from Babylon, India, Greece, and Persia, all drawn to this magnificent repository where human knowledge reached its highest peak. And then, it all disappeared. The official story you've been told is simple. Accidents and religious extremism destroyed the library over time. Julius Caesar's ships caught fire during a siege in 48 BCE, and the flames spread to the scrolls. Later, Christian zealots burned what remained, declaring the pagan knowledge heretical. A tragic loss, but explainable. But what if that's not what really happened? What if the Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed at all, but systematically looted by those who understood the true power of controlling information? Here's what doesn't make sense about the official story. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building filled with books. It was a vast complex, with multiple storage facilities spread throughout the city. 400,000 scrolls don't just burn up in a single fire. And here's the most suspicious detail. While the building may have been damaged, there's no historical record of anyone attempting to save the scrolls during these supposed catastrophes. Think about that for a moment. When the World Trade Center was attacked, people risked their lives to save computer data and important documents. When Notre Dame caught fire, teams immediately rushed in to rescue priceless artifacts. But when the greatest library in human history was supposedly burning, no one thought to grab the irreplaceable scrolls, unless of course someone had already grabbed them. Here is a theory that will chill you to the bone. What if the most precious scrolls from Alexandria were secretly relocated long before any fires or religious purges? What if powerful institutions realized that controlling knowledge meant controlling civilization itself? Consider the timeline. As Christianity rose to power in the Roman Empire, pagan knowledge became increasingly dangerous. Ancient texts about medicine, astronomy, and philosophy often contradicted Christian doctrine. Books containing maps of unknown continents threatened the Church's view of creation. Scientific treatises that explained natural phenomena without invoking God posed existential threats to religious authority. So what would you do if you were a powerful religious institution facing a library full of knowledge that could undermine everything you stood for? Would you really just let it all burn? Or would you quietly acquire the most dangerous texts and hide them away where they could never challenge your authority again? Fast forward to today. Deep within Vatican City, behind walls that have never been penetrated by outside lie archives that contain an estimated 85 kilometers of shelving. That's over 50 miles of documents, manuscripts, and texts dating back over 1,000 years. The Vatican Secret Archives, recently renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives, officially contain diplomatic correspondence, PayPal documents, and administrative records. But according to researchers who have tried for decades to gain access, there are sealed sections that remain completely off-limits, even to accredited scholars. What could be so dangerous that it must remain hidden after all these centuries? What knowledge could be so explosive that even academic researchers can't be trusted to see it? Here's where the theory gets truly disturbing. Several medieval manuscripts reference scholars fleeing Alexandria with cartloads of scrolls during the 4th and 5th centuries. These refugees didn't head north to other centers of learning. They headed west, toward Rome, toward the growing power of the Christian Church. Now imagine you're a church official in the 5th century, and desperate scholars arrive at your doorstep carrying scrolls that contain advanced medical knowledge, detailed astronomical observations, and philosophical treatises that predate Christian thought by centuries. Do you burn this invaluable knowledge, or do you lock it away, keeping it safe for future use while ensuring it never threatens your religious monopoly? There are tantalizing clues that this is exactly what happened. Renaissance scholars like Leonardo da Vinci and Copernicus demonstrated knowledge that seemed to come out of nowhere, understanding of anatomy and astronomy that shouldn't have been possible with the limited resources available to them. Where did this knowledge come from? What if they had access to ancient texts that officially no longer existed? What if the Vatican had been selectively sharing lost knowledge with trusted scholars, while keeping the most dangerous revelations locked away? Modern requests to access the Vatican's deepest archives are met with polite refusals and bureaucratic delays that stretch on for decades. Researchers who get too persistent in their requests sometimes find their academic careers mysteriously stalled. Funding for projects that might reveal uncomfortable truths about church history dries up without explanation. And here's the most chilling possibility of all. What if the scrolls hidden in the Vatican's vaults contain knowledge that could revolutionize modern science and medicine? What if cures for diseases, solutions to climate change, or technologies that could transform human civilization are gathering dust in secret chambers because they threaten existing power structures? Think about the moral implications. If the Vatican possesses ancient knowledge that could save lives or solve global problems, but keeps it hidden to maintain religious authority, then we're looking at one of the greatest crimes against humanity ever perpetrated. Of course, the Vatican denies these allegations. They claim their archives contain nothing more than historical documents and administrative records, but they also refuse to allow independent verification of these claims. And this pattern of acquiring knowledge through questionable means didn't end with ancient scrolls, because what we're about to discover next will show you how the Vatican systematically looted artifacts from other civilizations, disguising theft as preservation. We're about to enter the Vatican's Egyptian Museum, where stolen gods sit in silent display, witnesses to one of history's most elaborate cultural heists. And the story of how these sacred artifacts ended up in Rome will reveal just how far the Catholic Church was willing to go to acquire the treasures of other civilizations. Walk through the halls of the Vatican museums today, and you'll encounter something that should make your blood run cold. 9 galleries filled with Egyptian artifacts, ancient mummies, stone statues of gods, and hieroglyphic tablets that once held sacred meaning to millions of people. Tourists snap selfies next to these relics, completely unaware that they're looking at the spoils of one of history's most systematic cultural thefts. Welcome to the Gregorian Egyptian Museum. Established by Pope Gregory VI in 1839, the Vatican proudly presents these artifacts as evidence of their role in preserving ancient culture. But the real story of how these sacred objects ended up in Rome is far more sinister than any museum placard will tell you. These aren't just artifacts. They're stolen gods. Let me take you back to the year 31 BCE, to the shores of Actium, where one of history's most decisive naval battles was about to change the fate of civilizations. On one side, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, representing the rising power of Rome. On the other, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, fighting desperately to preserve the independence of Egypt and its three. When the smoke cleared, Egypt had fallen. And with that, defeat came something that would echo through the centuries: the systematic looting of one of humanity's oldest civilizations. What happened next wasn't just military conquest. It was cultural annihilation, disguised as appreciation. Roman soldiers didn't just occupy Egyptian cities, they stripped them bare. Sacred statues that had stood in temples for millennia were pried from their foundations. Mummies that families had lovingly preserved were torn from their resting places. Stone columns covered in hieroglyphs that told the stories of gods and pharaohs were hauled away like trophies. Picture the scene: Egyptian priests watching helplessly as foreign soldiers desecrated their most sacred spaces, families weeping as the preserved remains of their ancestors were carted off to decorate Roman villas, an entire civilization's spiritual heritage reduced to exotic decorations for the homes of conquerors. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. These weren't just random acts of wartime looting. This was organized, systematic cultural theft on an industrial scale. Roman officials created detailed inventories of the most valuable Egyptian artifacts. They established shipping networks to transport massive stone statues across the Mediterranean. They even brought Egyptian craftsmen to Rome as slaves to help install and maintain their stolen treasures. Fast forward through the centuries, and these looted artifacts found their way into the collections of Roman elite, then medieval nobles, and eventually into the hands of the Catholic Church. By the time Pope Gregory established his Egyptian museum, the Vatican had accumulated one of the world's largest collections of Egyptian artifacts outside of Egypt itself. And here's the most chilling part. They called it preservation. The Vatican's official position is that they saved these artifacts from destruction, that they preserved Egyptian culture for future generations. But let's be brutally honest about what really happened here. When you take sacred objects from their original context, when you display them in a foreign country for foreign tourists, when you profit from exhibiting another culture's spiritual heritage, that's not preservation. That's exploitation. Imagine if the situation were reversed. Imagine if Egyptian soldiers had invaded the Vatican, stolen the Sistine Chapel ceiling, ripped out and hauled them back to Cairo to display in an Italian museum. How would Catholics react to foreigners taking selfies next to their most sacred art, calling it cultural preservation? But the Vatican's Egyptian collection represents something even more insidious than simple theft. It represents the deliberate erasure of religious truth. Many of these artifacts depict gods and goddesses whose stories predate Christianity by thousands of years. They contain religious concepts that directly contradict Christian doctrine. By removing them from their original context and displaying them as curiosities, the Vatican has neutralized their spiritual power. Think about it. An Egyptian statue of Isis, the Virgin Mother Goddess, sits in a Vatican museum just miles away from St. Peter's Basilica, where millions worship another Virgin Mother named Mary. The parallels are impossible to ignore, but by treating the Egyptian artifacts as ancient history rather than living religion, the Vatican has made it easier to dismiss the uncomfortable similarities. And this pattern continues today. Egypt has been fighting for decades to get its artifacts returned. The Egyptian government has formally requested that major museums, including the Vatican, return stolen cultural treasures to their homeland. But these requests are met with legal technicalities, bureaucratic delays, and claims that the artifacts are better preserved in European institutions. The message is clear. We took your culture, we'll decide what's best for it, and we'll keep it as long as we want. It's cultural imperialism in its purest form, disguised as scholarship and preservation. But there's an even more disturbing layer to this story. Recent investigations have revealed that some of the Vatican's Egyptian artifacts may have been acquired through more recent illegal channels. Art dealers, tomb raiders, and corrupt officials have been smuggling artifacts out of Egypt for centuries, often with the knowledge and sometimes the direct participation of major collecting institutions. What this means is that when you visit the Vatican's Egyptian Museum, you're not just looking at ancient artifacts. You're looking at evidence of ongoing cultural crimes. Every mummy case, every carved stone, every golden artifact represents a piece of Egypt's soul that was torn away and put on display for the entertainment of tourists. The Egyptian gods that once commanded the worship of millions now sit in climate-controlled cases, reduced to curiosities behind glass. The sacred texts that once guided an entire civilization are now academic specimens to be studied by foreign scholars. The mummies of people who believed their preserved bodies would carry them to eternal life are now gawked at by tourists who have no understanding of their spiritual significance. But Egypt's stolen gods aren't the only sacred secrets hidden within Vatican walls, because what we're about to discover next will reveal how the Church has suppressed not just foreign religions, but forbidden teachings from within Christianity itself. Deep in a forgotten rubbish heap in Egypt, archaeologists found a document so dangerous, so contrary to accepted Christian doctrine, that it had been banned, burned, and buried for over 1,000 years. The first Apocalypse of James contains teachings allegedly from Jesus himself that contradict everything the Church has taught about the nature of God and creation. Prepare yourself for revelations that could shake the very foundations of Christian faith. In 1945, in a desolate rubbish heap near the ancient Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, an archaeologist's brush uncovered something that would send shockwaves through the Christian world. Hidden among discarded pottery shards and forgotten papyrus scraps lay a manuscript that had been buried for over 16 centuries. Written in ancient Greek, it bore a title that should have been impossible: The First Apocalypse of James. This wasn't just another ancient text. This was a forbidden gospel, containing teachings allegedly from Jesus Christ himself, that had been systematically hunted down, burned, and erased from Christian history. For over 1,000 years, the Church had tried to ensure that no one would ever read these words again, but the desert had preserved what human institutions had tried to destroy. Now, before we dive into what this document reveals, I need you to understand something. If you're a practicing Christian, what you're about to hear might fundamentally challenge everything you've been taught about your faith. The teachings in this forbidden gospel don't just contradict modern Christianity, they present a completely different vision of God, creation, and salvation itself. According to the first Apocalypse of James, the material world we live in wasn't created by a benevolent, all-loving God. Instead, it was constructed by a false deity, an impostor who imprisoned human souls in physical bodies to keep them separated from the true divine realm. Think about the implications of that statement. If this teaching is authentic, if it really came from Jesus, then everything Christianity has taught about God's creation being good and perfect is a lie. The entire foundation of Christian theology, the idea that God created the world and saw that it was good, crumbles completely. But it gets even more radical. According to this forbidden text, salvation doesn't come through faith in Jesus as the Son of God. Instead, it comes through secret knowledge, through understanding the true nature of reality, and learning how to escape the prison of material existence. This isn't the gentle Jesus of Sunday school, teaching love and forgiveness. This is a Jesus who claims that the God of the Old Testament, the God who created the world, is actually a cosmic deceiver. A Jesus who teaches that true enlightenment comes not through worship, but through gnosis, through hidden knowledge that can free the soul from its earthly chains. Now you might be thinking, if this document is so old and so significant, why haven't you heard about it? Why isn't it studied in theology schools or discussed in churches? The answer will chill you to the bone. Because the early Christian church launched one of the most systematic campaigns of intellectual destruction in human history, to ensure that texts like this would never see the light of day. Starting in the 4th century, as Christianity gained political power under Emperor Constantine, church leaders began hunting down and destroying every copy of these alternative gospels they could find. They branded them as heretical, declared anyone who possessed them to be enemies of the faith, and sentenced people to death for the crime of reading the wrong version of Jesus' teachings. Imagine that. Being executed for reading a different account of what Jesus actually said. The systematic destruction was so thorough that for over 1,500 years, these texts existed only as references in the writings of early church fathers who condemned them. Scholars knew they had once existed, but believed every copy had been successfully destroyed. Until that day in 1945, when the desert gave up its secrets, What archaeologists found in that Egyptian rubbish heap wasn't just the first apocalypse of James. It was an entire library of forbidden gospels, hidden away by Christians who refused to let these teachings die. The Gospel of Thomas, containing secret sayings of Jesus. The Gospel of Philip, describing mystical rituals that the Orthodox Church had banned. The Gospel of Truth, presenting a completely different understanding of salvation. These weren't fringe documents written by crazy they were sophisticated theological works, many of them dating back to the 1st and 2nd centuries, potentially as old as or older than the Gospels that made it into the official Bible. And here's what makes this discovery so explosive. It proves that early Christianity was far more diverse and complex than the Church has ever admitted. There wasn't just one version of Jesus' teachings that gradually evolved into modern Christianity. There were dozens of different Christian movements, each with their own gospels, their own interpretations of Jesus' message, their own understanding of God and salvation. The Christianity we know today isn't the original, pure version of Jesus' teachings. It's the version that won a political and theological war, the version that managed to destroy all the competing alternatives. But here's where this story gets truly disturbing. Even after these forbidden gospels were rediscovered, even after scholars translated them and made them available to the public, the vast majority of Christians still don't know they exist. Why? Because religious institutions have found new ways to suppress dangerous knowledge. Instead of burning books, they simply ignore them. Instead of executing heretics, they marginalize scholars who study alternative Christian texts. Academic careers are quietly destroyed. Research funding disappears. Publications that explore these forbidden gospels are relegated to obscure academic journals that no ordinary person will ever read. The result is the same as it was 16 centuries ago. The vast majority of believers never learned that there were other versions of Christianity, other interpretations of Jesus' teachings, other ways of understanding the divine. But here's what the Church fears most. Knowledge spreads. Truth has a way of surviving even the most systematic attempts at suppression. And right now, as you're listening to this, you're participating in something that terrifies religious institutions more than anything else. You're learning what they don't want you to know. If this video has opened your eyes to just how much has been hidden from you, then you need to do something about it. You need to subscribe to this channel right now, because we're just getting started. Hit that notification bell, because the powers that control information don't want these truths spreading, and algorithms can be manipulated to suppress content that challenges established narratives. Share this video with everyone you know. Comment below with your thoughts, because engagement is the only way to break through the digital censorship that keeps this information from reaching more people. The more people who see this, the harder it becomes for institutions to keep these secrets buried. And if you want to go deeper, if you want to learn about the forbidden gospels they've tried to hide, if you want to understand how Christianity really developed and what Jesus might have actually taught, then you need to seek out this knowledge yourself. Don't wait for permission from religious authorities. Don't let anyone else decide what you're allowed to know about your own spiritual heritage. The truth is out there, waiting for you to discover it. But it's up to you to take that first step. Subscribe, share, and keep watching, because what we are about to reveal in our final segment will show you just how far modern religious institutions are willing to go to create fake miracles and deceive their own followers. The age of burning books is over. Now they create lies so sophisticated, so technologically advanced, that millions of believers are fooled into thinking they re-witnessing divine miracles when they actually looking at the products of secret, embalming techniques stolen from ancient Egypt. Stay with us for the shocking conclusion that will change forever how you see the relationship between faith, science, and institutional deception.